Sorry for the mosquitoes. This is outdoors. We have spray all around, so if you want to spray yourself, you sure can. And hopefully the candles help too. Well, this all came to be because of this wonderful lady here, Nancy Beck, who loves to go to garage sales. And so she'll tell you the story of finding something to start it out.
I had nothing to do with building the CCC Park, however, the history is there. So, and this was the site where we're sitting, and I was able to bring a fair amount of pictures, so please take a look afterwards. The years, how I got more interested, I got on the Friends of Interstate Park, and in 3 summers ago, I do go to a lot of sales, and there was a sale and dresser. And there was this, what appeared to me to be a government-issued trunk. And it had Camp Interstate on it. And so I talked to the gentleman that was selling it, and yes, indeed, he had gotten it out of a barn, and he knew for sure that it was government-issued. I did a little more research on it, and it's got all the stickers and stuff inside of it. It is on its way here. I thought that it might be here by now, so we can take a look at it. Those of you that maybe have been in the military or the Army know, it's not very big what you put your whole life's worth of stuff in and carry it around. And we are getting closer to knowing whose trunk that is. So hopefully, we've got a couple of leads. We don't know exactly where this gentleman grew up or anything. He had put his initials on it. But one of the things that had been a little confusing, that actually just some info that we got made it a little more sense. Camp Interstate actually started and was organized in Illinois. And then over several different stops, it turned into Camp Interstate with the same number. So that's been a little bit confusing trying to find who all was in here. So again, there's lots of info back there. The trunk will be a really good asset right around the same time. We know that that is coming, that the Ice Age Center is going to be hopefully remodeled within the next 5 to 10 years. And we would really like to see the CCC history more prominent. Because if you guys have seen any of the different documentaries and pictures and stuff, everything was done by hand, and it's just incredible what they have built across the country. And we have some really fine examples of their work with all the stairs and the buildings. Another thing that really helped progress our little archive, there have been some things here at the park that we've just been able to find. But we also had a gentleman contact the park from California. His name is George. His father's name is Harry Kulik. And his father was here when he was only 14 years old. And that is really on the young side to be at the park. And he traveled around in all these stops with this company 633. So that explains why he has a lot of pictures that are from different places. And he also, the camera is back there. For a 14-year-old kid, he had this decent camera, and he took pictures of everywhere he went. So those two booklets back there are pictures that he took and things that he saw. There's a couple pictures of downtown St. Croix in there, and to think of this, this young kid doing all of this is pretty extraordinary. Far away from home. George, the son, came last fall, and Trudy and I were able to show him around the park that day, and he was just, it really brought the history to life for him too, to think of where his dad was. And some really good, he gave us a pennant, he gave us a framed picture, anything that he had, he wanted it to be in the archive. So that has moved us forward a lot. And the one other interesting thing I remember is Harry's father, the kid that was working here, saved all of his money that he was earning, because they sent money home. The worker got to keep $10, I do believe, for his job, $5, and then the family got sent $25, I believe. And his father saved all that money for Harry when he came back. So when Harry came back home after working for probably about 3 years in different parks, that was what allowed him to start in business on his own. And I believe it was plumbing, if I remember correctly. And that set him up really for the rest of his life. A hard worker, and the things that he learned here at the park, because they did teach them a lot of things. It wasn't just doing stuff for us. There were definite trades that they all learned. And so he was able, that made such a difference in his life at the time, and then throughout his whole life, having that little nest egg to start with. And I'm looking forward to hearing more what Bill Jamerson has to say. He has a lot more knowledge about this. We'll be around if you want to look at some more of the pictures. Please do. There's some nice pictures back there of the park. Because I think during that time the DNR sent photographers, because there are some beautiful black and white photographs of the different areas of the park. So that's nice to see too, that these have been preserved. So we look forward to expanding the history at the Ice Age Center, and this kind of is a little bit of a renaissance, I feel like, around the different parks. If you go into parks that have that were built by the CCC, you can really tell the difference there. So kind of seek those out. A lot of parks, Wisconsin and Minnesota, were very populated with CCC parks. So thank you all for coming. We appreciate it, and I think that's enough.
I would be remiss if I didn't thank the wonderful Historical Society from St Croix Falls. We asked them to partner with us to have this program brought here, and they were willing to do it, and many of them are here tonight. So pats on the back for you. Thank you so very much. Here's Mr. Jamerson, who's renowned for doing this program.
Thank you, Trudy. And thank you all for coming out this evening. You have a remarkable park here and a remarkable friends group. And Nancy Beck's find with Harry Kolich's photograph collection really is priceless. Just a few side points that came up. She mentioned that Harry was 14 when he enlisted. Well, you were supposed to be 18 to 25 years of age to join the Seas. Why did that happen? Well, a lot of the guys lied about their ages. It was quite common to use their brother's driver's license. But when you're 14, it's really tough. And I've run into a couple stories of 14-year-olds, and the way they got in was the mothers would lie about their ages, okay? The mothers, and they would kind of look the other way, because they knew this family was so desperate. If they turned away that, they were paid $30 a month, and $25 was sent home to the family. Now in today's money, that's $500. So they knew that family might starve if they don't allow that kid. So, okay, we'll accept them. Okay, they would take him. And the officers in camp would kind of take them under their wings and make sure they didn't get bullied too much or be, put on the job assignments which were too dangerous. Maybe they weren't fighting forest fires. Maybe they were out, doing land surveying, something a little bit less dangerous. And the trunk that Nancy found at the garage sale. Just think about the trunks. When you came into camp, you were issued a trunk, but you were charged $3. What they would do is they would subtract 50 cents a month from your paycheck. So after 6 months, you own that trunk. So everyone had a trunk, but there were some enterprising young people who would collect those trunks when the guys would come out of camp, and then they'd be around to sell them to the young rookies who came into camp for $1.50 or $2, okay? So sometimes you would get trunks like that. So this camp is Nancy mentioned, was originally in Sheridan, Illinois. And it was not uncommon. Camps would exist for 2 years. Remember, these camps were manufactured housing, so to speak. They could put them on rail cars, break them down, throw them on trucks, move them 50 miles. If they were out in the farm fields, they moved to another town. If they were planting trees, well, we planted, 10,000 acres, we're going to move 20 miles this way, you see? So that's what would happen. So they were very flexible and they were allowed to do that way. So it was in 1935 they came up here. Now, this area here was the campsite. Now, the typical campsite had about 24, 25 buildings. You had an officer's quarters, a mess hall where they ate their meals. Every camp had a library. They had a blacksmith shop. Remember, all the hardware here in the park was made in the blacksmith shop. So you look at the door handles, the fixtures, the lanterns, okay, those were all original. And the interesting thing about the C's, I've been to dozens of parks, no two, hardware are the same. The lanterns are all made by different blacksmiths, so they're obviously all different. So that's a great contribution to our folklore. They had a carpentry shop here. They were building picnic benches, park tables, chairs, furniture, and some of those tables may exist. I haven't been up there in the Ice Age building lately, but some of these parks, you can tell the original picnic tables are about 3 inches thick, with really beautiful wood. And a lot of these fellows came out of camp with blacksmith skills, carpentry skills, and they became their professions. So you would have typically 4 to 5 long, narrow bunkhouses, and they had cots in them, and there were typically 3 wood-burning stoves to heat those young men. And it could get cold in winter. If you were too far away from that stove, you froze. If you were too close, you burned, okay? So it was tough. You had a recreation hall with a canteen. And the canteen in this building is one of the most beautiful canteens I've ever seen. It has all the stained glass behind the canteen, where you buy, your rolling tobacco and Coca-Colas and candy bars and so forth. And they had pool tables and ping pong tables. One woman said, I always wonder where my dad learned how to play ping pong, because he built the kids a ping pong table, when they were growing up in Iowa. And you had, what else did you have here? You had an education building. They had these counselors, educational advisors in the evening would offer classes, okay? And, about 1 out of 5 of these young men were illiterate. They couldn't read or write. They dropped out of school to support the family. I met a fellow in Lower Wisconsin, Jamerson. He says, well, they closed my school. The county didn't have enough money to keep the schools. We forget that. During the Depression, they actually closed schools. And that's why the kids couldn't go to school. They didn't have the money to pay the teachers. So the C's filled in that gap of teaching these young men. They came in, so many were disadvantaged. And about 20% of them earned their 8th grade diplomas. And these 8th grade diplomas were like high school today, equivalent. Very difficult courses. So Monday night you'd have a history teacher coming from town. By the way, they brought in unemployed teachers to teach these young people. Everybody was out of work. One fellow told me the first day in camp, the captain came out and said, well, I'm here because I needed a job. You're here because you needed a job. I'm going to show you respect, but I want some respect in return. So they would hire these locals, what they called local experienced men, LEMs. So not only did they hire unemployed teachers to come in, but they would hire these electricians and plumbers and carpenters to offer vocational courses in the evening. They kept these guys busy from 7 o'clock to 9 o'clock every night. One fellow said, yeah, if they didn't keep us busy, there'd be a lot of fights going on, So the camps are like a combination of high school, vocational training and military. They were the combination. I know I'm kind of scattering around. I'm not very organized tonight. I'm just kind of going off the head. But the CCC was not a military program. They were run by civilian officers, unemployed, there we go again, unemployed World War I veterans. Those are the guys that ran the camps, okay? But there was no drilling with guns. Otherwise, mothers would not let their sons sign up. The First World War was only 15 years earlier. They didn't want their kids to learn how to march with a gun. So there was no drilling. But everything about the camps was military. There was, 6 o'clock, 6:30 reveille, exercises, calisthenics outside in the morning. They'd go into to breakfast. They'd hit the trucks at 7:45. Everything was clockwork, They came back from camp and they had a period of recreation where they could do sports and play chess and checkers and write letters, shoot pool, and then they put on their uniforms and they went up and they had what's it called at the flag? retreat at the flag, where they all had their little stone they stood next to, and after the retreat, the lowering of the flag, they would go in to have their dinner in the mess hall, and after dinner they left their uniforms on and they would go to their classes. Some kids would go to English or math class, other kids would go to carpentry or electrical wiring class, okay? And by the way, they also offered college, what do they call them, courses, by mail, what is correspondence. I've been getting this program for a year, so excuse me. College correspondence courses. So you could, take courses with the University of Wisconsin, forestry or accounting, business principles and so forth. So they kept those guys busy. Anyway, so I'm going to digress and just kind of go back to how I normally begin a program, okay? So excuse me for getting so deeply into it. I always like to begin by asking anyone out there have family members in the Seas? Yeah.
Have or had?
Had, yeah. A dad?
Yes, and his brother.
And where were they in camp?
My dad is in Grand Rapids, and we had a chance to go there. They rebuilt the barracks that they stayed in, and
Hold it, Grand Rapids, Minnesota.
Minnesota.
Okay, I'm not aware of that. There is, some of you may have heard of Black Duck, Minnesota. Camp Rapidu is a camp with 20 buildings. But I wasn't aware of anything in Grand Rapids.
Lots of tree planting.
Well, there's a visitor center about it. I don't know if that was a camp.
Oh, I see. Okay, there's a visitor center. Okay, so any experiences about your dad? Did you learn any particular traits?
Well, like I said, he ended up having to follow the big tractor or whatever. Planting these trees over and over, and they never let up, so he was amazed at the work. But I think the funny part is that I have this letter from my grandmother who asked him if he could possibly send more money than the $25.
Isn't that interesting? Could he send more money beyond the $25?
And she had two sons.
She had two sons. That meant she was getting $50 a month, which is the equivalent of $1,000 a month. The multiple is 20, okay? You can buy a candy bar for a nickel. You all know this. Go to the movies for a dime. Your money went a long way. One fellow told me, he says, me and my brother were in the Seas. By the way, when the Seas originally began in March of 1933, only one child per family was allowed. But in 1937, they relaxed the rules because enlistment was going down. War was brewing in Europe. Mothers were keeping their sons out. So they were allowed 2 per family. And that's what happened. One fellow said he and his brother were in the Seas. He said his mother felt like a rich woman. For the first time in her life, she had a savings account. Okay? And the neighbor guy, the fireman, was getting paid in these government chips, these coupons. And she was getting $50 cold cash every month. It was a big deal. And planting trees was huge here in Wisconsin. Where was he in camp? What town?
Up near Grand Rapids, up near in that area.
In that area, okay, very good.
Well, they moved because they're planting trees, so they're...
Right, they moved the camps. Yeah, we'll talk about tree planting later. Anyone else have family members out there? Yes?
Jay Cook State Park, and it was my grandfather Jones.
And Jay Cook?
Jones.
And what kind of work did he do out there?
He died, I might have been 8, so...
Well, they were building trails, they were building shelters, everything else here in what they did in parks. Yes. Who else had family members? Yes, sir.
Yes. My dad was up in Scott Township in Wisconsin, and he was in the CCs. He built bridges and roads across swamps. He said laying big long trees across the swamp and filling it in, and so they could keep on going.
It's miserable work.
Yeah, really.
Imagine being out in the mosquitoes in the swamps, okay, all day long. One fellow told me he was hanging telephone wires. This is up in northeastern Michigan in the Upper Peninsula, in Paradise, Michigan. Isn't that a nice name, Paradise? He said the black flies were eating them alive. You're hanging on a telephone pole, hanging wires. Where do you run? He said that the doctor in the camp, every camp had an MD, mixes citronella with this black tar solution. And they gooped it on their faces and their hands, to protect themselves. Okay, they were desperate. He said it worked great, but the problem was those black flies would stick to your skin, and they'd walk across your face and tickle your nose. And he said, you couldn't pull them off because your hands would get all greasy. You know, they're handling, you know, screws and nuts and bolts and things. It was miserable work, working out in the slums. But it made them into men. See, I went to a CCC reunion in June of 1992, and I met several dozen of these fellows. And I was a young documentary filmmaker. And they shook my hand. It was the best year of my life. Turned me from a boy to a man. Made me grow up. Took me off the streets. Every one of them sung the praises of the seas. I said, boy, this would make a great video. So I came back and I interviewed these fellows, and I made a documentary for public TV. And Nancy Beck, I would love to help co-produce a documentary on this park with all those archives. It might only be a 15-minute long video, which we can show up on the Ice Age building, but we ought to talk about that at some point. It'd be a lovely little video. Those pictures are marvelous. Who else had family members out there? Yes?
My dad was up in Camp Sawyer near Hayward in Winter, Wisconsin.
Yep, that's where my dad was at.
Okay.
Was he planting trees up there? Or?
He planted trees, forest fires. He also drove the ambulance for the camp.
You know, it was hard work planting trees. One fellow said, well, it turned those city boys, it toughened them up. See, the farm boys were tough. You know, by the time you were 12 years old, you were working 8, 12-hour days, right? But the city boys had never worked. They were unemployed. And, you know, you plant 1,500, 2,000 trees a day. Typically, they use a planting bar. They called it a dibble or a spud bar. And you jam it in, you pull it back, you make this hole, you put the roots down there. The trees were 2-year-old white pine, jack pine, red pine trees, seedlings. The seeds would collect these pine cones, and they would buy pine cones from the neighbor, the children in the community. Little girls would come in with a bushel basket of pine cones. They'd put the word out, the CCC camp is buying pine cones, and they'd pay them a nickel, you know, these little children. And they would heat those cones to release the seeds, and those seeds they'd plant in these huge nurseries, which the C's supervised and worked in. They'd grow them for 1 year till they were 6 inches high, separate them, replant them till they were about 18 inches high, and that's what they planted. They planted over 285 million trees here in Wisconsin over those 9 years, from 1933 to 1941. Yes?
She also brought with her father's CCC jacket.
You brought it tonight?
It's with tonight if anyone wants to see it.
We would love to see it, and we'd love to have it donated to our new exhibit here. And you think I'm joking. Well, didn't I, Nancy, did I donate something?
Yes, you did. I got that back there, Bill.
Yeah, so you know, I donate things all the time. People give me things, and I pass them right along to places I see a need for. So all joking aside, in the next 5 years, you may consider it. That would be a lovely addition. And if you'd like to hold it up and show everyone, that'd be marvelous. How about a little song? Just so I know some of you heard about my great singing talents. Yeah, right. Anyway. I brought this guitar. I better sing a couple songs or Judy's going to ask for her money back. Oh, look at that coat. Yeah, stand up, please, stand up. Yeah, that is that's a wool.
Wool, it's heavy.
Wool heavy coat. That's what they wore in the wintertime.
What's interesting.
That's a work coat. That's not a officer's dress coat.
No, but I don't.
Actually, I'm not wearing my glasses, so I'm guessing that's something you wear in the field, or does it look like a dress coat?
I would say it's more of a dress coat.
Uniform. Okay.
Did you want to see close?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. This is what they would wear in good shape. That's in fabulous shape. That's what they would wear into town. That is so rare. That is so special. That's what they would wear in town. When they came into camp, they were issued work clothing, and the dungarees and the winter coats were more dungaree, more like canvas material. Thank you. And these CC boys would come in. Some of these guys told me they'd throw their clothes away. when they came into camp. Remember, to qualify for the Cs, you came from the poorest families, okay? You had to go through an interview process, and your family had to be on relief from a farmer who was not on relief, but who was very poor, okay? And these fellows would come in. I met a fellow in Georgia. He said that when he came into camp, he said everyone on that bus, when they came into camp, was barefoot. Imagine a busload of young men getting off barefoot, and they would issue them work boots, dress shoes, underwear, socks. Many of them had never had a new pair of shoes in their lives. Work clothes, dungarees, that's blue jeans, and then the uniforms, and the dress shirts and the ties and so forth. And it meant so much to them. Well, he finds a pair, takes them and runs and steals them, runs down the street, cuts into an alley where there's a beat cop having a cigarette in the alley. That's where they took their breaks. And he'd been busted a few months earlier for petty thievery. He was on probation, so now he was in trouble. But the officer took pity on him. He said, "You're a good kid. You belong in the CCC." And again, just to refresh, the Cs was created by Franklin Roosevelt. It received bipartisan support. It was in March of 1933. Remember, the stock market crash happened in 29. From 1929 to 33, half of the factories shut down in America. You know, unemployment was 25%. In the mining towns and the logging towns, the unemployment was 70 to 80%. Just off the charts. There just was nothing to do. So the officer said to him, "You're a good kid, you belong in the Cs." Whoops. Oh. Turn that down. So I wrote a little song. He was only 16, he stole a pair of shoes. Officer said, "Boy, you've gotta choose between a life of crime and doing the right thing." The judge looked down upon his face and said, "We gotta get you out of this place. It's time for a new start in the CCC." He arrived scared and angry, feeling all alone, not knowing what he would find. He discovered a world he could call his own, a place he found peace of mind. Well, they woke him one day at an early morning hour, showed him through the fire lookout tower, showed him the land he had to defend. Spent 6 months fighting fires by hand, shoveling dirt turns a boy to a man. He's walking the streets, hungry back home. After a year in camp, that young man had grown. His shoulders were straight, his shoes had a shine. He discovered a world he could call his own, a place he found peace of mind. Yeah, true story. Anyway, the officer recommended to the judge he'd be allowed to sign up for the Cs instead of going to jail. So the judge gave him a choice. You can go to jail for 6 months, or you can enlist, volunteer for the Cs for a year. That was very common. In fact, in New York and Pittsburgh and Chicago, police were rounding up young men on the streets and charging them with vagrancy, taking them down to the police station and then giving them a choice. You know, we're going to throw you in jail for 30 days or you can volunteer for the Cs. One woman told me, and this is a true story, she said her father had 2 jobs in Chicago. He was working. He was on the street walking between one job and another job when he was arrested and told that he better join the Seas or go to jail. I couldn't believe it, but it's true. She told me. It really did happen. And these are the untold stories you won't read about in books, okay? But they were very aggressive. They couldn't do that today. But they literally were clearing the streets of young men. And in the song, I use, in the refrain, is a place he found peace of mind. The fellow that told me the story said it was peaceful. He was taken off the streets of Detroit, shipped up to the Upper Peninsula in Michigan. He said it took him a few nights to get to be able to sleep because it was so quiet. He'd never been in such quiet before, you know. And he said the first time in his life he ever, you know, heard wind blowing through trees, you know. These things we take for granted, but we have to remind ourselves being in nature has a rejuvenating effect on young men, especially those who come from the big city. So imagine in 1935 these young men coming up and camping out in this rustic area and going out and quarrying stones and building hiking trails and building structures. It was just a fruitful activity. My friend told me he got a letter from home, and his mother wrote that his neighbor had been evicted, another neighbor had lost his job, and his high school buddy was in jail. It was all bad news. He wrote her back and said, "Mom, if you can't write anything nice, don't write it all. I don't want to hear about it." It really is true. If you look at those pictures back there from Harry Coolidge, you'll see the smiles on the guys' faces. You know, they were just so happy to be up here. They were getting 3 square meals a day. And, you know, imagine, some of these fellows told me how the city boys would come into the mess hall, and the first time they walked in, they'd see the food laid out in these platters. It was served American style. And they would grab the food with their bare hands and start shoveling it into their faces. And the cook would come out with his cleaver. "Sit down, we use silverware around here." They had never seen food like that before. Okay? Now for breakfast, scrambled eggs with chunks of sausage, toast and jelly, ham, bacon, real bacon, these guys told me. Cereal, coffee, pancakes. One fellow used to take a big stack of pancakes. He never finished them. Well, the cook found out one day, came out and stood behind him with a knife in his hand and said, "Okay, Buster, you're not getting up until you eat all those pancakes." "Yes, sir. Yes, sir." Started shoveling those pancakes down. Now, for lunch, they brought the meals out to the work sites. So they'd be out, you know, building roads or planting trees or someplace. They'd bring out these canisters of tomato stew and hot muffins, hot bread and sandwiches. And by the way, they patronized the local farmers. They'd buy the leftover produce on the weekends. They'd come driving in with their pickup trucks full of bushel baskets full of potatoes and carrots and cabbage. And they built these root cellars in the sides of hills. And in my book, I tell how they would hollow out the ground in these root cellars and put blocks of ice in there, okay, with sawdust between them. And then they would cover those with boards, and that kept them cold. And one solitary light bulb to provide light. You have sides of beef and, you know, all these eggs and all the food to feed 225 men in camp. That's a lot of mouths to feed. But they'd have those very efficient root cellars. And they would save the kitchen garbage for the local pig farmers. I'll never forget this fellow in Iowa. He says, "I was only 15. I was too young to be in the seas, but my dad raised pigs, and I used to drive his Model A pickup truck into that CCC camp every night, and they'd save their kitchen garbage for us. I'd dump it in the back of the truck. We fed that to our pigs. I tell you, I don't know how we made it. I don't know." He just broke down and cried. I said, "Can I get your phone number, sir? I can't talk about this." So they did a lot of things for the locals. I could tell you a half dozen pig farmer stories, you know, how they helped the local neighborhood. neighbors. And by the way, when those farmers came in, bringing their leftover produce, they'd tell the farmer, fill up your truck with gas on us. Get yourself some oil too on your way out. That was a big deal to local farmers. Get some oil and gas, okay? Now, for dinner, they always started them off with soup. You had to eat your vegetable soup before you got the main course. That's how they got these guys to eat their vegetables. And a fellow up in, what's that little town next to Duluth? Begins with an H. Hermantown. Yeah, a fellow in Hermantown said, well, this rookie came in, it was his first night at camp, he was on his third bowl of soup, he was just chowing down like crazy. I said, how come you eating so much soup for? Well, I'm hungry. Well, save some room for supper. I thought this was supper. Oh no, we get dessert too. What's dessert? Yeah. Now for the main course, pot roast, meatloaf, corned beef. It was meat and potatoes, food that stuck to your ribs. And for dessert, every camp had its own baker. Pudding, pie, cake, cookies, ice cream. I used to ask these fellows, what was your favorite dessert? Oh, those chocolate-covered parfaits were so light and fluffy. Oh, they get teary-eyed. And sometimes there are a few surprises. One fellow said that he was on in Idaho. I haven't told this story for a while. He said they had an old lumberjack baker who made the most delicious cinnamon rolls. He said one day he peeked in the back door of the bakery and watched him as he was kneading that cinnamon roll, the pastry. He said the old lumberjack was chewing tobacco, and he had no teeth. And the tobacco juice was just dripping down his chin. He said, I never ate those cinnamon rolls again. Yeah, the food was good. The food was plentiful. But there were surprises. Nobody left hungry, by the way. They always had peanut butter or sandwiches or extra hot dogs. No one left hungry. The average recruit put on 30 pounds in their first year. I remember some of these guys, one guy said he put on like 40 pounds. But one fellow told me, he said, I felt like shouting hallelujah when I walked in the mess hall. I said, that sounds like a song to me. So I wrote a little song, and the chorus goes, if my stomach could talk, it would shout hallelujah. Trudy, do they have permission to shout hallelujah?
Oh, certainly.
Okay, I want you to join me. If my stomach could talk, it would shout hallelujah. Okay, I want you to join me then. Way back in the Great Depression, my stomach was in a mild recession. Folks were poor, people were hungry, couldn't get work all over the country. Excuse me. Well, Franklin did build for you and me some work camps called the CCC. Put us to work, fed our bellies with lots of food like bread and jelly. Here we go. If my stomach could talk, it would shout hallelujah. He asked me to walk, I'm gonna come running right to ya, 'cause it's chow time. Who says duck eggs hot on the griddle? What the farmer brings is always a riddle. We eat what's put in front of our faces. Chow time, give me a taste. Corned beef, roast beef, smothered in gravy. Piles of noodles, long and wavy. Turkey at Christmas, filled with stuffing. Apple pie, straight from the oven. If my stomach could talk, it would shout hallelujah. He asked me to walk, I'm gonna come running right to ya, 'cause it's chow time. It lives for a year, won't fatten you up. Your ma won't know you 'cause you're all filled out. When you eat, no talking at the table. Cook's got a knife, he's a bit unstable. It's not gourmet, but 3 times a day. Eat all you want, you don't have to pay. If it ain't moving, I'm digging in. No telling where this food's been. If my stomach could talk, it would shout hallelujah. Yes, and walk, I'm gonna come running right to ya, 'cause it's chow time. Who's getting hungry? I hear some stomachs growling out there. Come and get it. I know you're hungry. I'm going to go through some of the things the C's did across Wisconsin. Because, yes, they built these beautiful parks, but they did so much more. And by the way, when we talk about CCC parks, I'm sure most of you are familiar. Wyalusing, Devil's Lake, Rib Mountain, Pattison Park, Copper Falls, Whitewater. All of these parks, they had such a huge contribution. Now this park was started, I believe, in 1900, so it predated the C's, but the C's added so much more. The hiking trails, the shelters, the bubblers, those are the water fountains. Park furniture, every CCC camp that built a park built that furniture. Again, they provided all the hardware from the iron. Now, every park that was built in the state used local resources. They harvested the trees, they used the stone. So if there was river rock, that's what they would use to build the buildings with. If there were granite boulders, that's what they would break up. The type of trees, if you go to Florida, they have parks made with palm trees. Okay, the structure's done. That was one of the unique things about CCC built parks. Everything came from the grounds, nothing outside. Nothing was imported from China. So that's what makes them so unique. And also the design of the parks. We don't want to forget it. It's every park had to be approved in Washington, D.C. They were under tremendous scrutiny. They called it the prairie style. Remember, there was an earlier history. Parks were very symmetrical, very linear. Okay, they would have established patterns, and the sidewalks would be straight and all. Well, the prairie style, which was designed to make the parks fit in with the landscape. In other words, if you have a sidewalk or walk path, a trail, you would go around the tree instead of cutting the tree down. If you built a parking area, instead of just clearing a flat area, you would have maybe 2 or 3 levels of parking, so it would fit in easily. So they worked with the topography. That's why so many of these parks have such a wonderful feel to it, because a lot of thought and effort was put into how to make the buildings in harmony. You would have areas, you would be under trees to overlook a open area, so you could be in the shade, for example. And the beautiful beaches they built at so many of these parks. And we don't want to overlook this very simple fact. We love our parks today. We wouldn't be here today if we didn't. But we can't even imagine, none of us in this room can imagine how much these parks meant to the people in the Great Depression. These are people, they didn't know what a vacation was. There was no Disney World. There were no theme parks. There was no going to Wisconsin Dells. You worked. But suddenly there was 20 miles away, there was a park. Interstate Park, Wyalusing, Devil's Lake. Why? You go there for your high school reunion, a Sunday school picnic, your sister's wedding reception, okay? Suddenly, like, I'm an American. This is, I work, the sweat on my brow, I can go to this park and enjoy myself, do something fun. I go canoeing, horseback riding. And there would be lines of cars on Saturday morning. And the beaches were so filled with people at these parks, there were no space to see the sand. I mean, you see these photographs, it's amazing. So we never want to forget the fact that the parks met a need, and that was to provide entertainment and recreation for the people of Wisconsin. So while we cherish these parks today, it was just simply a whole different level, 80, 90 years ago. Now I lost my train of thought. So, we were talking about the different things they did across the state. Well, probably the number one thing was getting fires under control and planting trees. You see, the problem with the forest fires in the Great Depression, many of those fires were started intentionally. There was no work in these rural communities. So you would start a fire, and the county would pay you 15 cents an hour, $1.25 a day, to fight the fire you started yesterday. Okay? Now, I'm sure there's a book that describes this. In Michigan, we have a book called Michigan on Fire. And they have a chart. In 1933, there were 2,000 fires, 5 acres or larger, every summer. And then it goes down to 200 by 1940. And that's because when the seas came, they stopped hiring the locals to fight those forest fires. And by the way, the seas were not well loved when they first came to these communities because they took their jobs of fighting forest fires. Okay? I mean, you got 4 hungry children to feed. It's not a laughing matter. You're out there starting fires. Okay? Very serious work. There's no work out there to speak of. So the seas came and they take over. Now the seas would typically build truck trails to get to these fires. Access was critical. So they'd cut in there, cut these rough truck trails. They would put up lookout towers, dozens of lookout towers, and they would wire the local ranger station, who would then contact the nearest CCC camp. So they would jump on these stake trucks, you know, these open stake trucks. You got 30 guys, and with these watering cans on their backs and shovels in their hands, and they drive through, and then they would drive as far as they can when the roads ran out, and then they would walk. Think about that. They'd stop, and then they would walk to try to find the fire. Okay? And typically, they'd take the lightest and littlest guy and send him up the tree every 100 yards to sniff the air for smoke. He climbed the tree, you know, I think it's over here, Sarge. Okay, let's go this way. Then they walk for another 2 hours to find that fire. And then they put it out with their shovels. This is miserable, miserable work. My son started a fire when he was about 6, and I was pretty dicey whether I would get it under control, but I did. You can't breathe, you're hyperventilating, it seems to keep spreading. It's very, very difficult work. And these guys were teenagers fighting these fires, but they got them under control. Hand in hand with fighting forest fires was planting trees. Oh, by the way, I was in southern Illinois, and down there I read the account of how the local boys would start forest fires on Friday night. So the C's would have to fight fires on Saturday, and they wouldn't come into town to steal their girlfriends. Yeah. And by the way, a lot of these climate change fires are intentionally started. I think some of you know that. In Australia and Brazil, there are groups that are paying people going out starting those fires, and then they're blaming it on climate change. And it's nothing new. It's been going on for decades. In fact, in Colorado they have fires. They start fires around ski resorts. They don't want them to build ski resorts, for example, and housing. So it's still a problem today. It hasn't disappeared. Planting trees. I spoke how they would grow these seedlings so they were 1.5 years. These fellows would go out there and plant 1,500, 2,000 trees a day. Then they had tree planting contests. They plant up to 5,000, 6,000 a day. And they had these young University of Wisconsin college graduates who came out of the forestry school. And they had to be young, they had to be strong, and they were young officers. And they'd follow up these fellows, and they'd give those trees a little tug, make sure they were planted properly. Some of these fellows had a sense of humor. They were chewing tobacco, and after they planted that little seedling, they would spit their tobacco juice on that seedling. So the unsuspecting officer would come up, give the seedling a little tug. Oh, he'd get that tobacco juice on his hand, you know. He didn't appreciate that. But they did tremendous follow-up. The survival rate of those trees was something like 94%. If the tree died, they would replace it. In the summertime, if it was dry, they'd go out and have these wheelbarrows and these barrels with water, and they would water them by hand to get those trees to the dry summers. I mean, they really cultivated it. And those trees generated millions of dollars for the state of Wisconsin in the 1990s and the early 2000s when they harvested them for telephone poles, those red pines. Because you harvest them when they were like 55 to 65 years of age, and they're just about 12, 13 inches. So it generated millions of dollars. It was a tremendous investment. The forests, we all know, regenerate themselves on their own. but the seas basically would speed them up by 50 years. The seas also restored hundreds of miles of river waterways. And what do we mean by this? Well, the lumberjacks cleared the land, and what happened is the rivers basically died because the water levels warmed up. There were no trees to keep the water level cool. They had these log rolls to roll the logs into the rivers every spring, but that destroyed the vegetation. So the rain came, washed that soil into the river. That soil covered up the stones, the spawning ground. The fish populations died away. So the seas came in, and then the gullies, they would put down these poles and put fencing in and bring in trucks of stone and fill in those gullies. They would put riprap, they plant grass seed, okay, to restore those riverbanks. They built hundreds of wing dams. These are dams below the surface of the water, which redirected the water. If there was erosion on a bank, it would prevent that erosion. The wing dams would create eddies for fish to repopulate fish holes. All kinds of, by the way, there's a wonderful museum in Rhinelander, Pioneer Park, a CCC museum. If you're ever in Rhinelander, visit it. There's a book about an inch thick. It's called The Wing Dams of the CCC. I am not kidding. And they're just all these different wing dam formations they use. Beautiful photographs. I'll never forget this. So they restored hundreds of miles of rivers. Some of those rivers were not restorable. They were just too far gone as far as bringing back the stones. But tremendous work. They did, what's it called when you drop the weights in the water and monitor the depth of these lakes? Sounding. Hundreds of lake soundings. They'd go out in the wintertime, cut holes in the ice, measure the ice. They did rodent control and rabbits and things that would damage crops. They put up fencing along roadways. They built wells for farmers. They put up over 1,800 miles of telephone lines. In 1933, only 20% of rural Wisconsin had electricity. Basically 4 out of 5 people were using kerosene lamps. Did anybody grow up with kerosene lamps out there? There we go. I mean, it was not uncommon. But the Seas not only put up telephone lines bringing electricity, but they also wired the homes for free. They put in light bulb sockets, electrical outlets. A fellow in Nebraska told me his father and his buddies, they wired this lady's house, and they told her, we'll be back in the afternoon to turn on the juice. And when they came back, she put bowls underneath all the light bulb sockets, to capture the juice, okay? The Seas built over 6,000 miles of roads and truck trails in Wisconsin. Remember, in the 1920s, there were 2 tracks. People had horse-drawn wagons, right? Remember? Well, the Seas came in with their Caterpillar tractors. They bulldozed those. They created ditches. They elevated that, and then they would crush gravel. Put crushed gravel on those roads to create roads for automobiles. It just goes on and on. The more you look into this, the more you'll find. And these resources are a great place to begin. We're getting kind of toward the end, and I'm just warming up. Any questions out there? Any particular areas you want me to talk about? Yes?
Will they really know what they're doing from day to day, or
So a conservation camp, every camp had a particular, niche, okay? Planting trees, working with farmers, building a park. So they had definitely projects ahead. They worked with a lot, for instance, if they were building roads, they worked with the local county road commission to determine roads. If they were building state parks, they worked with the state park. So they had a lot of direction. So there was no, there are a lot of criticism of Franklin Roosevelt's make-work programs, okay? You give 100 men a shovel and have them, dig a sewer line. It could have been done by a bulldozer, right? But you can never say that about the Seas. It was the one program you could never criticize. Their work was very well thought out, very well executed. And what they did, they did the best. And the quality of work, by the way, in these state parks, when you see really beautiful stonework, that wasn't done by a bunch of 18-year-olds from Racine, okay? Those are done by local experienced men. I mentioned that earlier. They hired these local stonemasons, local plumbers, local blacksmiths who would come into town. They executed the work. So, one fellow told me he was in, this is in northern Indiana, he said this old Finnish stonemason was up there building a chimney, and he'd take, like some chicken wire, number A, 5A or something, and mold it into the shape of the rock that he wanted. He'd throw it down to the guys, they'd go out to the rock pile and find the rock, okay? So, everything worked, everything just seemed to work. It provided employment for so many different aspects of the people. Well, let me talk just briefly about their socializing. Can I go 5 more minutes?
Easily.
And if you're getting eaten up by mosquitoes, you've got to go. That's understandable. They were required to be in camp all week long. Saturday morning, they had camp cleanup until 11 o'clock. Then camp inspection. Okay, they would inspect the cots. Everything had to be clean. From noon Saturday until 10 o'clock Sunday, they were allowed to go into town or go home to their family. See, some of these guys had cars. They weren't allowed to have cars in camp, but they'd park them in the woods. They'd pay a farmer, 10 cents a month to park their car. And 5 buddies would get in that car, and maybe they would drive back to Milwaukee for the weekend, okay, to see their folks, okay? But most guys stayed in camp, and they would go to the local town. So St. Croix, in 1935 to 1937, imagine about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, a truck, 3 or 4 truckloads of maybe 100 guys would pull into downtown St. Croix, and these guys would filter out. They'd go to the bowling alley, the billiard hall. They'd go to the movie theater, saloon. Some of these guys were drinking age. Some would go shopping, buy a new pair of shoes, And the girls would be waiting for them. The girls would show up. Remember, the dads were telling their daughters, stay away from those CCC boys, they're trouble. Well, what happens when you tell your daughter to stay away from somebody? Yeah. One fellow told me, he said, he'd go to the movie theater and they'd be kicking on the back of your chair. And you turn around, hey guys, want to share our popcorn with us? The girls could be very aggressive. A woman in Newberry, Michigan told me how when she was 14, all her girlfriends would go to the movie theater and stand outside on Saturday night and wait for the C's to show up in their trucks. And then they would pair up with them, go into the theater and hold their hands. I said, that's it? They just want to hold their hands? Yeah, we did too, 14-year-olds holding the hands of 20-year-olds from Milwaukee. But they just love these guys. And so many of these gals met their husbands. And so many guys met their wives. I met a woman in Iowa. This was 10 years ago. She was 16. She was outside of a little convenience store, and somebody was throwing pebbles at her back. And she turned around, and there were 3 or 4 CC boys leaning against a fence, and one of them had a kind of a sheepish, smile, like he was a guilty party. Well, she said a few weeks later, she and her mother were hitchhiking, and they got picked up by a pickup truck. And driving that pickup truck, it was a CCC pickup truck, was that same guy with a smile, And then she said 2 months later, she was at a dance. And someone came up behind her and tapped her on the shoulder and put his hands over her eyes. And she turned around, and sure it was that same man. And that became her husband. I can't make that up. A woman in Clinton, Indiana, another cute story. She said her father used to telephone home every weekend. And he loved the voice of the operator. And he told his bunkmates, I love that voice. I'm going to find that voice. I'm going to marry that voice someday. You just see. Well, a few months later, he's at a dance. And sure enough, he hears the voice. And the voice has a boyfriend. He taps the boyfriend on the shoulder and says, bug out, buddy. I'm going to marry that voice. And he did. He did. Now, many of the guys did their courting in church. So here in camp, they'd go into church, drop them off, and they'd go to the different churches on Sunday, and they would walk the girls home after church. Very common. A woman told me down in Tennessee, she said her father was with his buddy in church, and his buddy said, "See that cute brunette over there? I'm going to ask her to walk her home after church." Her dad said, "Too late, I already asked her." He was bluffing. He hadn't. But he did. And sure enough, he walked her home, and in time they dated, and that became his wife. I can't make these stories up. But Saturday night, they loved to go dancing. And in these little towns, they didn't have dance halls in St. Croix. It was a tiny little town. But what they would do is they'd find an empty building, an old city hall building or some empty, and some enterprising young person would rent that building for Saturday night, and you could hire a band from Milwaukee or Eau Claire for $5, a swing band with 10 people, right? And they'd hold a dance, and they would charge 20 cents at the door, 25 cents at the door, and they'd come in. One woman said, well, we'd go to the dance hall Saturday night, and all the girls would line against the wall. She said all the CC boys would line against the wall, and all of us girls would dance with each other, right? Girls and girls. And she said the CC boys would make little signals like, hey, can me and my buddy, can we cut it on YouTube, you know? And the girl, what do you think, Agnes? I don't know, those guys are kind of, I don't think so. So they kind of politely go, no, thank you. And if they want to, they go, yes, and they come over and cut in on them. She said the reason they did that was it didn't hurt anybody's feeling. You could get rejected. Instead of tapping someone on the shoulder and getting turned down, everybody could see. No one know her feelings. It was all kind of on the sly, okay? And that's how they did it. So let me sing one more song. And so let's go back to 1935. And by the way, I want to thank Trudy again for all your effort, all your work. Thank you. And Nancy Beck for taking that big step. And for all of you, and there's a donation box back there. And I know how much you all care about this, but I'd like you to put an extra $5-10 in for this exhibit. It's going to take money, it's going to take time. When you're dealing with photos and enlarging things, we got to really think now. We need to build up a base of money so we can create a wonderful exhibit. It's going to take several years, but it will be worth it. Imagine walking into a room and having these beautiful photographs and quotes and articles of clothing, hopefully. Remind her. Again, thank you so much for coming out. My name is Bill Jamerson, and I didn't read from my book. If you like these stories, if you know someone who would enjoy these stories, it's 380 pages, chock full of real stories. It's a historical novel based on my friend. Remember the fellow that stole the shoes?
Yeah.
It's about his life in the camp. And 90% of the stories really happened. And I've sold over 5,000 of them, and it's a great gift. $20. If you like these songs, I got 17 of them on a double CD, plus stories. So I talk for 5 minutes and then sing a song. So it's great for a long trip. You got grandkids, you pop it in, you get a history lesson. And then I have, I've got a couple of DVDs, my film on Michigan, the CCC's in Michigan, okay, which is kind of similar to Wisconsin, but it's also a nice gift. So come on up afterwards. And I'm very serious, Nancy. I want to make a film, even if it's a 10-minute film, about this camp to show in your visitor center. So let's turn back the clock. It's 1935. The CC boys are dressed up. Some of them got their uniforms on. Some of them are in their clothing. They're going into town to meet the girls. It only happens once a week, but oh, that feeling is so sweet. It's Saturday night. We're going on the town. I planted about 10,000 trees. I did it all on bended knees. Now we're on the road and pleasure bound. My shoes are shined, my pants are pressed. Oh my Lord, I must confess, I'm gonna paint the town red tonight. Short or tall, I'll take them all. Blondes, brunettes will have a ball. I'm gonna find me a gal and do it upright. We are the CCC, blowing in town on a breeze. We're gonna dance and twirl you girls all around. If you're looking for a good time, then come to us, we'll begin. We're the nicest guys you've ever found. A nickel buys a single dance, it's worth it to have a chance to hold a pretty gal right in your arms. We treat them nice with lots of care. We use Brill cream in our hair. It's Saturday night, we're pouring on the charm. Dorothy, Betty, Mary Lou, my name is Bert. How do you do? Will you be my dance partner tonight? Well, I do the polka and the swing. I love to waltz and other things. I'll stay off your toes if you hold me tight. We are the CCC, born in town on a breeze. We're gonna dance for you girls all around. If you're looking for a good time, then come to us, we'll begin. We're the nicest guys you've ever found. Well, I remember this woman came up after my program once. She said, well, that was a fine program, but you forgot the most important thing the CCC did for America. I said, really? Yes. I said, what was that? Well, they gave us a lot of great husbands. Thank you. Do you have any questions out there? I'll keep my answers brief. Yes?
I'm wondering, my father was in the CCC, but I don't really know. Is there
Okay.
some place in Wisconsin we can send
Yes,
him?
there is a place. There's a website called ccclegacy.org. ccclegacy.org. It's a national collection base, okay? And lots of information. Go to archive, go to research. You can phone, telephone number in St. Louis. Give them your dad's name, his birth date, and they'll tell you what camp he was in, what years. And if you send them $75, they'll send you all his paperwork, his discharge papers, medical reports, all of that kind of stuff. Yeah. But ccclegacy.org. Yes. And by the way, it lists all the camp in Wisconsin. So if you say, oh, my dad was in camp at Rice Lake, I wonder where that is. Boom, you go to Wisconsin. Go to Rice Lake. It'll say 1/4 mile northwest of town, or see what it'll tell you geographically a point. Not too accurate. Then you go to that town, and other people can help you from there. Yes, sir.
Are you old enough to remember watching the Bowery Boys?
Yes.
Because there's a segment of, on the camps on one of their films.
There's a movie. Leo Gorcey Hunts Hall. It's there's a CCC. The only CCC movie I found there was a Bowery Boys movie. It's hilarious. It's really cute. Yeah. I forgot the name of it, but you can just go on Google and find it. Anyone else out there? Yes, sir.
When they wrote letters home, were they free franked or did they have to buy their own postage?
They bought their own stationery and their own postage. And back then it was like 2 cents a letter. I'll tell you an interesting thing. I've had many women bring in letters that their dads wrote to their mothers. And they are the most heartfelt letters you will ever read. They always ended with, they always began, dearest mother. But they always ended, love, you're devoted, ever-loving, faithful, obedient son, Harold. They make you cry. I mean, some of these things. And by the way, a lot of those letters, not ever, but most of them would say, at the end of the letter, say hi to Dad, okay? They write this 2-page letter at the very end. Say hi to Dad, Oh yeah, the letters are a very important thing. Just a cute little story. I remember one fellow told me how, I don't know where I heard this, but this woman told her daughter to send a key to the CCC boy, okay? And she didn't say what the key was for, but it got them writing letters, okay? And in time, he married her, okay? Isn't that interesting? Lots of stories about writing letters. Yeah, any other questions out there? Yes, sir.
If you look online, all the camps had their own newsletters. And for instance, this camp here, you can find all the newsletters that they did like every month or two about what was going on in the camp, written by their own. These were handwritten, mimeographed ones here.
Where are they?
Well, they're online, and if you send me an email, and I'll tell you where they are.
I know where. Women would bring their sick children into camp to take care of them. So that's how they fostered a lot of goodwill over those years, very quickly. All right, well, again, thank you so much. One last question. Yes,
Overview, okay, so the CCC was a federal program.
Yes, national.
But was it, a two-part question, was it mandated to the states, so the states sort of distributed it, and then the states sort of retained the parks and such? And then how many were in the overall CCC program? I mean, 100,000, half a million?
No, that's a good point. I started a little bit off this tonight. There was about 95,000 here in the state of Wisconsin, 2.6 million nationwide, an average of 200 young seas in the parks. And good question. It was a federal program, but the number was really left up to the states as far as finding spaces. For instance, if you had plans for parks, the feds would provide the money and manpower. But you had to have those plans. Pennsylvania was way ahead of the game. Indiana, Iowa, way ahead of the game. That's why they have like 20 CCC parks. Wisconsin was slower. Michigan only have a dozen, okay? So the states had to, on a statewide level, had to have projects to justify opening those camps. So it's a good question. Again, I'll be around for a few minutes. If you like a book or a video or CD for a gift for someone, I'll be happy to autograph it for you. Thank you again, everyone. Have a good night.
Well, you've been an outstanding audience. Pat on the back for you. And I wanted to tell about this park. I have spent a lot of time here, especially with my twin granddaughters. And one of the things that we were taught is how these CC camp people worked with no machinery. How did they get this basalt, as we know it as trap rock, to break? They heated it up and they brought cold water. Can you imagine doing that to make this wonderful park? And if you wonder, when I march around here, why are these steps uneven? You know why they're uneven when you know all the work that they went to. And with no further ado, thank you so much for coming. And Nancy has the announcement of the night.
The forgotten trunk has arrived. So take a look at the trunk back there and imagine, excuse me, the young man hauling that around place to place, and that's what they get. So, and please look at all the other pictures. I know it's getting a little bit dark, but we also, the Ice Age Center is open. We can get the pictures out there if somebody contacts us ahead of time. So thanks everybody for coming. Thank you, Bill. We've been talking for a while, and with COVID, it was great to be able to finally have you here in person. So thanks everybody for your interest.